Good morning, everyone. Matt Konwiser, been with IBM for about 10 years. I'm the field CTO for the Northeast here, specializing in AI. I've been involved in AI for well over a decade at IBM and others, and I was actually at Beryl Elites last year as well, speaking on it. Bob?
Bob Lytle from Related Analytics. We're a Canadian startup recently acquired by Coface, the trade credit insurer. I started my career as a software developer for TransUnion and worked through the ranks, so I was their compliance technology lead, implementing CFPB protocols, GDPR, and so on. Now we do business data, commercial data, and alternative data for investments and for banking and insurance.
Martin Oko, Head of AI Operations at TIAA.
Chris Brown, I help run the Inception program at NVIDIA, which is our program focused on startups.
Very good. So as we heard, this topic is governance, and quick question from the audience here: how many folks have heard of or have used a self-driving car? About half of you, I think. Okay. How many people think that somebody should be able to operate a self-driving car if they don't have a driver's license? And there's only one hand up. So that's the fundamental challenge with governance and AI. Now, how many people here have used AI, either for work or for home? Just about everybody. How many of you understand how it really works? And quite a few less. So that's the dilemma, right? Should we be using technology if we don't fully understand how to use it? So I want to ask the panel first, when you think about governance and ethics in AI, what does it mean to you? What's the first thing you think about?
A lot of work. Now, one of the things that we look at in the banking and insurance industry is they're so highly regulated, whether it's on the European side, we've got new California regulations. The new election is going to lead to some regime of additional regulation. One of the benefits that I had coming from a large credit insurance or a credit agency is that we knew that that was baked into our products from day one. So building a startup, we were able to pretty quickly enhance the products that we had with a regulatory layer on top of it. And that, I believe, is what helped lead us to be able to work more effectively with financial agencies and insurance companies. Do not ignore the amount of extra work that it requires, as most of us know in the industry.
AI ethics, AI governance. I'd like to boil it down to brick and mortar. So when you think about AI governance, think about guardrails. Think about building a foundation. So you have foundational principles, and you build those foundation. You will need brick and mortar. So think about the bricks as the governance component, and without the mortar, you cannot. They don't hold together too well. There are a lot of gaps, and a lot of things can seep through. So governance and regulations can do a lot in terms of bringing us close to compliance, but ethics is what glues these pieces together.
I mean, on a personal level, I look at governance and ethics within AI in the same way that I look at it in every other facet, right? You know, we have a lot of things, like to your question about, like, do we know how it works? There's a massive number of technologies that exist within our daily lives that we have no conception of how they work. I mean, you know, even the subway, we could ask a lot of people and they're like, yeah, I don't quite know how it gets from here to here and how they switch lines and all that. So with governance, it's more a matter of what's the sort of end point that we're getting to, and that's the thing, as we do, I think, with most regulation, like that's the thing that we should look at and say, hey, like, this was the outcome, right? And that's a negative outcome, and we need to figure out how to address that. So, you know, for me, I think trying to figure out like what is going to be the thing that people do with this, because of the massive number of use cases, is going to be less effective than figuring out how do we make sure that, like, the outcomes, you know the self-driving cars aren't crashing and all that, that those outcomes are in line with what we look at as like reasonable and thoughtful, governance principles and ethical principles.
So on that note, you were here last year, and I think you said one of the big use cases last year was in the healthcare space. So what's changed from last year's Beryl Elites to this? What are you seeing that's new, that's emerging, that's altering because of governance and ethics or other technology?
I don't know that it's necessarily because of governance and ethics, but I would say the most common thing that we're seeing is just a continued focus and pickup on those areas that are, I like to say, highly supported by AI, right? You know, when you have kind of low-level functions like data entry and things of that nature, you know, sales development, stuff of that nature, like all of that we've seen more and more pickup on. So customer service, you know, SDS people, you know, advisory, like all of this is stuff that is enhancing or has the capacity, I should say, to enhance what it is that people do kind of at an entry level in a business. And I think that has continued apace. Like that's the most common use case that we are seeing by far.
You know, I'd say, Matt, you know, in the last year, or at least in the last 2 years, we've had several new regulations come out. In the U.S., California seems to lead the way. Obviously, as a Canadian startup, we see them being highly activist. The EU artificial intelligence regulation just came out, kind of officially put a stamp on it earlier this summer. And, you know, you want to put yourself to sleep, go and read this document, but understand the key parts of it are about high-risk systems that an inferential AI system, not Gen AI only, but systems that have or purport to have the ability to make decisions or infer by themselves. Those that would potentially impact another human in a way that would violate some ethic or some law are now put into a bucket. Once that happens, you need to register the system. The system needs to be documentable, explainable, and banks, insurance companies, large institutions have to pick a stance for this. Normally in this market, what we see is companies kind of retrenching a little bit, spending time saying, I'm going to be a little bit slower. I need to have systems that are easier to explain before I'll step in. So, you know, while it's exciting, and we get excited on the tech side and building new things. I love the first panel that was here this morning. And they talked about all the potential for AI. What we have to realize in the market is that folks in your industry, in the investment industry, have to be looking at whether or not we actually can accomplish what we want to because of these regulations. It's a lot stronger now than it was a year ago.
Yes, last year when I was sitting here, I had suggested that AI was going to be a commodity. At that time, we were only talking about ChatGPT predominantly. And since then, there's been a proliferation of foundational models. Today, there's a multitude of choices of models we use. Well, last year when we were here, we were talking about prompt engineering, and that was a new career area. Pretty quickly, prompt engineering has been taken over by AI today. Gen AI is taking prompt engineering. And lastly, there was very little mention of small language models. Today, small language models work in concert with large language models, and AI is beginning to self-regulate. Organizations that are building AI systems are now using small language models to enforce governance and regulations.
Very good. Now, you talked about California. One of the interesting things about SB 1047, which I think was vetoed, was the limits they set on it were actually so high that none of the models out there today would even be governed by it. So regulations are one thing, but regulations that actually work well are another beast. So let me ask you this: in Related's business, how do all these regulations and all the changes and all the new types of models that we were just talking about, how is that affecting your data business as you're appealing to financial services clients?
So, you know, we got a little ahead of the game because we knew from the beginning, before we started using AI, that we needed to be able to point to where I got the data. As an alternative data provider, I can present almost any kind of information you want. Here's something that you can figure out if you're a signal. And we have investment companies purchase this and seeking the kind of lever that they want. The next question that has to be asked is, where did you get the information? And the early LLMs were not very good at doing this. There are some that are stronger now than they were. Certainly, as you know, Matt, and the IBM side, they've gone as far as to say, we're so sure what's inside our LLM that we'll actually indemnify users of that from IP infringement, right? But we have to be able to point to where you got the information. And it's a little bit more difficult if you're working with a third party or a black box where you're not exactly sure. Most of the new AI systems allow you now to come in and ask the question, okay, so tell me why. Tell me more about that. And the best ones will actually elucidate that for you. So from our business, it's about taking the extra time to make sure when we deliver a data set to a customer, I can go down to the field level and say, I know this came from here. I'm not sure I can tell you it's true or it's false. What I can tell you is the three sources agree on that particular piece of data. That at least is a bulwark against folks coming back to us and saying, you helped me make a bad decision because you didn't know. I'll simply emphasize it's not easy. Right? There's so many sources, but being able to point back to those at a field level has been a godsend for us.
So, on that same line, Martin, as a user of the data, we heard earlier, it was said that you shouldn't look at AI as a model. You should look at AI as almost a full end-to-end story arc of the data that goes in, the prompting, the model, all the people that touch it. How is the regulatory landscape affecting how you use the data and the models? And are you looking at it that holistically?
Yes, that's a good question. A lot of us look at through regulations and today's regulation through the lens of the 6 blind men of Hindustan. So everybody you talk to has a different opinion on how to approach it. But I'd like to adopt the IBM principle of using precision regulation, where first you understand the foundational principles. You develop some foundational principles, and those foundational principles determine what technology you use and how you use them. So that regulations is not about regulating the technology, but the use of that technology. So to a given extent, we've leveraged that in a way that we choose when and how and what kind of technology to use, and then wrap our foundational principles around them so that it becomes the benchmark upon which we check how we go about it. So when it comes to the entire value chain, we don't drop in and just build models. It starts with a well-governed data, which means a well-understood data with its lineage. It needs to be well-governed and well-provisioned and well-secured. And then you build on top. So there's data governance and then there's AI governance. And these two work in concert today.
And Chris, what kind of guidance would you offer to a smaller business or a startup business that wants to get into AI, maybe in a regulated sector, knowing that all of this governance is coming down the pike? What would you tell them? What would be the 3 things you would tell them first?
Boy, well, I mean, first and foremost, something that I know it's weird to say, from NVIDIA perspective, but I find that technology is always going to be less important than the problem that you're solving, right? And I tell this to every startup, and especially in a time where, we have such this intense focus on engineering, developer-y sort of uniqueness, where it's we have an AI engine. Well, yeah, but are you solving a problem that matters to people? And I think a lot of times startups get caught up, and every business, but startups in particular, get caught up in this idea of oh, this is such an amazing thing that I'm building. They often lose sight of, yeah, but does it really solve this problem in a way that is incredibly efficient and is going to entice everybody to want to sort of buy from us? So first and foremost, worry above everything else about whether or not you're solving a problem that's critical and relevant. On the more sort of functionalist side, understanding data sources and where you're getting that from. If you are engaging in healthcare and fintech and other highly regulated industries, you have to understand where that data is coming from, and thinking about the tooling for guardrailing and being able to guide sort of the development of whatever models that it is that you're using, and then guide the outputs, also critical. Those are the top 2, and lastly, I'd probably say that the way that you kind of go about talking about your product, right? This focus that a lot of people have on, like, you know, I can't remember who I was talking to earlier about this, but this focus that people have on, like, oh, we're an AI tool. I think from a messaging perspective, coming back to how it is that you're, or the primary problem that you're sort of addressing for larger organizations that you may be selling to, like using that as your messaging as opposed to, oh, we're an AI company doing X, Y, Z. The amount of noise out there, being able to differentiate yourself. And to a degree, I think this applies to large businesses as well, where you'll see these sort of advertising marketing copy being like, you know, your AI solution for whatever. It's like, well, yeah, but that's not, I don't care that it's an AI solution, I care that it's a solution. And to a degree, I think that might diminish people's concern about, like, oh, should I like try this new tool? If you're changing the focus from how the tool works to what the tool accomplishes, I think that breaks down a lot of walls, right? And so, like, that's always how I like to think about things and what I would communicate to startups.
I want to add that to those organizations that are trying to break into this space, from regulatory or compliance or governance perspective, I would suggest that you stand at 40,000 feet and develop a governance complex enough to take care of the current regulations, but also adopt an opportunistic posture. So this framework should also be nimble and robust enough to look into the future and anticipate future regulations and be able to adapt to them as they become available.
One thing that Harry from the Federal Reserve talked about this morning was the idea that there's no way that we would put our data out in the cloud. We want to be able to bring that data in. One thing that I think is exciting for me when I look at the market, it's becoming easier and easier to bring this stuff in. And I'll bet you a lot of folks in the room here have experimented with different levels of LLMs and so on. You might be surprised if you actually talked with your technical team about what would it take for me to bring this stuff in. I don't know if I need a free computer from you guys or free chips or so on. But the concept of being able to bring this stuff in locally allows you a lot of power to be able to do that experiment. The first thing I thought of, Martin, when you said that was, how is Martin going to let his people experiment with stuff? He'd better be able to bring it inside. That being said, one of the pieces of caution, speaking now as a developer, if you will, it's really easy to get a simple answer, and it's really easy to get excited about an initial thing. Think of the amazement you had the first time that you used a ChatGPT or some other model. You go, wow, right? But what is powerful is the ability to go 1 or 2 or 3 levels deeper. The exciting part for me is that individuals can do this today in your environment. And you know, I'm a fan of the IBM stuff, Matt, but a lot of folks are using a variety of different tools, whether it's from Meta or from the open source community, that make it not so tough. The caution, and this is the key for governance, the caution is it's so easy to get some interesting value out of these things that you could very well find yourselves having the push to get it into production before having done the checks. And those checks are on things for compliance and governance that will get you after you put them in. A big shop like you guys, Martin, you're not going to make that mistake, maybe, and put something in and then realize it's a problem. But for many companies, and I can imagine in the investment community, many companies, you might actually get to the point where you put something in, you find that it's working, and you're not in a consumer business. Why do you have to care about, you know, human data in your models? It should never come, except the large language model has already trained itself on humans that now all of a sudden the EU comes and says, sorry, this entire class of models needs to be pulled back or documented. So even though your business has nothing to do with something you would think of in that kind of human regulatory aspect, you get dragged in because of the choice of using something.
So I'm going to ask a fun question now. There's a trend lately about asking a large language model for an analysis of you. Have you seen this out there? You ask a model that you use on a regular basis, tell me about me. What works really well? What do I do well? What would you fix? And so my private use case, my fun thing about AI is I use it to contradict all of those trends. So I asked it point blank, yes or no, should people be using a large language model for that type of insight about themselves, given how it's deriving the results? And it just said no. And I posted that on LinkedIn because I think it's very relevant. And the reason why it said no is because it admitted that it wasn't storing any of your information. It was just basing it off of abstract thought, air quotes, that it was deriving from the questions that it was asking and the tone and the sentiment you were using. So that's how I kind of use AI, as a way to contradict things. So what's a fun use case that the three of you use AI for?
Well, I think that if you were to ask something about Chris Brown, I'd get a really complicated answer about myself.
How would it know you are you?
It's like, but you know, I think that you know, there was a period at the start, and we go through all technologies kind of have this period of like, oh, this is a neat toy. And then society and business needs to spend some time figuring out, well, yeah, but also what's it going to do for us functionally? So, you know, I still do, you know, my wife and I, like, you know, we'll look up, like, you know, we'll ask it to generate art or kind of tell us about like specific places that we're thinking about traveling and things like that. But it's, you know, those are, I think, things that a lot of people do with it. But yeah, I think the toy phase is something that a lot of people are still in right now with it.
Martin,
I,
you're putting him on the spot. This is horrible.
for fun, I use it for press releases. If I want to do the press release,
Okay.
I feed it some information, see what it brings back, and then edit, do it again.
It's a press release on you? Is that?
Not on me. Any other
Okay.
activities.
Like a personal publicist.
Like no, like stuff that I may do outside work that may need a press release.
Chris mentioned something that it made me think, and I confess I am not, I don't have fun with it as much. But I have an employee who every day releases an AI-generated image for one of his projects. He teaches interns. And, you know, I have intel on things that are going on in his mind, and I can see these amazing images. And in the background of the images, what I see are little hints, little political statements or little things that, I mean, so it's not the actual image, but it's the things surrounding the image that I think are very, very, very cool. One thing I will say, and I confess to maybe not being as interesting in this, but the business side of being able to do this, in the first panel, Darius mentioned the idea of what's coming next is agent-based technologies, where you have a series of items chained together. This is done already in workflows like LangChain, but the ability for the system to call in, get a piece of data, say, well, that's interesting, let me call here and get another piece of data. Then let's send both of those in and go do something else. It's mimicking, it's truly mimic, but it's attempting to behave as a human would do. We spent a lot of time doing that. One of our products is a lead generation product. Hey, I want to sell you. I know a little bit about you, so let's get more and let's go and continue until I can now have a path for it. Matt, I don't know if that's fun, but it's actually quite compelling. It works quite well.
Well, I mean, there's a data scientist out there that's probably screaming, yeah, that's, so I don't know if this crowd would do it, but yeah, so I'll accept that as an answer. So with that little intermission over, let's get back to business. So you had mentioned the word guardrail. We heard guardrail this morning as well. I think that there's two ways to look at governance, especially for AI. There's guardrails and then there's tracks. Okay, so guardrails are more like soft governance. Like this is the general direction. You're in control of your own vehicle. Just don't drive off the curb. Don't drive off the cliff. And then there's tracks. This is the specific route you will take. You cannot deviate from it. If the track doesn't go there, you can't go there. So what do you think is the best way to do this? Are we looking at hard governance, or are we looking at soft governance? What's the best path forward?
Let's be clear, this is the Chris opinion, not necessarily the NVIDIA opinion, because I don't know what they're thinking at the top. But I think for businesses at the moment, guardrails, soft paths are going to be your best bet, simply because like you can't really predict exactly what the regulatory environment is going to look like. So being able to just say, all right, we believe that this is going to be the safest and most reasonable way to guide the development of whatever model it is that we're building. The guardrails that we're putting on, right? The tool that we have, for example, it effectively is a mini LLM that operates on top of whatever model it is that you're using, and says like, oh, I can't talk about that financial information. I can't talk about that health information. I can't talk about that personal information. So it just like brings it back in without saying like, this is kind of a hard path and the only thing that I can do. It's like, well, note the things that it can't do, and it kind of like, like in bowling, like, well, it bounces around and it gets to the end point eventually if you've got those like, the kiddie rails on the two sides. For businesses, I mean, for everybody, trying to predict the future is a fool's errand. So trying to say, all right, well, we're going to be reasonable and operate within this framework where I know it's going down this general path. I'm going to try and be safe towards it. I'm going to put on guardrails, as opposed to being like, this is exactly what the model will have to look like based on whatever the EU or the US or individual states do, is probably a safer bet, because you can also update those guardrails after those hard limitations come in to be able to be like, okay, now we understand what the regulatory framework looks like, and so we'll adjust to that.
I'm naturally a rebel. I don't say I don't like to follow rules, but I know that they impede my creativity. So, and I've seen it. I work with a lot of innovative space, and I see when you create hard rules, it impedes creativity. And you've seen with kids who are highly disciplined. As you grow up as a little kid, you're told what to do, what not to do. You become task-oriented. You can do specific tasks so well, but you cannot step out the box to see the box. So I encourage not breaking the rules and not bending them, but mixing guardrails with embedding the culture of trust within the organization. Letting your values lead instead. So you're embedding these qualities into your products instead of inspecting them into the process. So when you put tracks and you say this is what you're going to follow, most likely people will bend those rules or will break them. And then you will need also to now inspect quality in the product. But if you get people to get point, you create that culture of trust, so that whatever they build, they should be able to explain. You should also be transparent. And then I want to say something that is popular with the financial services and with corporations, aligning interest with incentive. So if I'm compensating you for what you did the last 3 months, and it doesn't matter what comes 3 years from now, then I'm not aligning those. I'm creating an opportunity for you to do what allows you to game the system and get what you need and don't care about the future. So part of this is also your data scientists, your AI engineers. You should start thinking in terms of compensation. How do you align the incentives with your interests as an organization?
I feel like, Martin, you just took me down the route of the bug bounty, right? Fix the code, and who fixes it first is going to get it. Or if you misbehave, is that what you're really talking about? So keeping folks aligned, I think it's very interesting. I think it goes against what the first thing I was going to say when you asked this, Matt, was as an inventor maybe or an innovator, I want guardrails or I want no guardrails if I could get away with it. As a business person, I recognize and realize, just like Chris from CoinFund said, right, this thing takes off only when institutions jump in. Institutions want tracks. And so maybe it's this friction between the two where I have to go down this path, but that path is the one that allows me to really accelerate the industry. It makes me lean towards that, although my heart goes to the reward, Martin, of being able to say, if I can stay kind of within the bounds but be much freer, I can actually achieve that a reward.
Let me rephrase this again and say that you can basically not necessarily align interests with incentives, but you can create a situation where people want to do the right thing and allow them. So in enterprise architecture, we do that something called you constrain the solution space. You identify the problem space, constrain the solution space, and then allow people to flex within that solution space. So you, as an organization, you can define your risk appetite and allow people to operate within that risk appetite. Allow people to flex, fail fast, fail cheap, and measure the impact of failure, and then reiterate.
So I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but you talked about the difference between governance and ethics before. And what I think I'm hearing from really all three of you as well is that if a business operates with integrity, and if the people understand their mission and understand the dangers and the potentials of the AI capabilities, and they use it with integrity, then that solves some of the problem and allows for those softer guardrails, because you don't have to worry about somebody doing something inappropriate or malicious, either intentionally or accidentally, because the people that are there and the company itself preaches that integrity, that ethical operation.
Yeah, you mitigate the risk of that happening. We're human, we're always going to make those mistakes. But by doing that, you mitigate that risk. I also encourage, it's a lot of implicit bias that goes into building these systems. And AI systems inherently will inherit from data that's already biased. And if you have an engineer or a data scientist or AI engineer who has implicit biases, those biases will bleed into the technology that you built. So part of what organizations may need to do is also find ways to allow their associates to get exposed to their blind spots and become a better person every day. Look in the mirror and become a better person, because that will bleed into the systems, the AI systems that you build.
No, I was just going to add, culture is far more important than any technology that we build or utilize. And I think about, our scenario where, when I tell people sometimes, they're like, oh yeah, there was a hiring freeze at some point over the last couple of years. People look at me like, that's insane. Like, NVIDIA's been doing amazing. And it's like, well, it's not about not, having the ability to hire people. It's about, you need time, especially when you are growing like this, to absorb people and integrate them into a culture. So, as we're building these tools, the foundations have to be, our organization tries to be thoughtful, right? And do well in the world. And if you're able to instill that deeply enough, then, your potential problems end up getting minimized, because you have people that are like, well, that seems like it's a bad idea. We shouldn't do that, right? So you're preemptively getting people to do the right thing. And I think that's the only thing that's going to always be a surefire way to kind of to help an organization fall within the sort of those lines.
So, closing thoughts. In a phrase or a sentence, if you were to take everything we talked about, everything that's going on right now around AI, and extrapolate out another 12 months, what's the big topic for next year's Beryl Elites?
Well, and I just said that trying to predict the future is a bad idea.
That's why I like it. Yeah, it's on the spot.
I think we're probably going to have continued conversations around new areas that are starting to. So last year you mentioned it was the healthcare area where we were seeing a little bit of pickup, and now it's continuing to be sort of low level function, right? Easily repeatable things. I think once you start moving into the real, right, AI's integration into robotics and things like that, that's where it's going to start to get really interesting, really exciting, because everything up until then, for a lot of people is less is less sort of tangible. But when you're interacting with AIs that are whether they're embodied or in any other format, I think that will be sort of a game changer.
I have the prediction next year we will be talking about a major event, just like in the old days it was the big data breach at Equifax. Next year we'll be talking about a major LLM-caused interesting event that we all reference and say, well, we don't want to be like that. Can you believe that happens? Don't know what it'll be, but I predict in a year we'll have it.
I guess we'll see. But thank you all very much. It's been a great conversation. I appreciate you, and we'll be around if anybody wants to chit-chat, but enjoy the rest of the day.